All right, welcome back. Today we are going to learn everything there is to learn about plot, or at least the parts we need. Okay, everything about plot. We know that a plot is a series of events that transpire in a story. 19th century German playwright Gustav Freytag outlined the events that make a great story, and he called it the Freytag Pyramid. When we say playwright, it's a person who write plays. A play that might be familiar to you would be like Wicked or Hamilton. Um, so if somebody writes a play, which is if you have songs, it's a musical. But if somebody writes a play like Shakespeare or Ibsen, they are called playwrights. So this guy in the 19th century named Gustav Freytag outlined an event. So he said that if you're going to make a great story, your story needs to have the following elements. So he called the pyramid Freytag pyramid after himself. And today or nowadays, we call it the plot diagram. So, in order for your story to be dynamic, exciting, fun, or just riveting, it needs to have an exposition, it needs to have a conflict, it needs to have a rising action, a climax, a falling action, a resolution, and then a denouement. So when you go to high school or college, you're going to learn a little bit more about denouement. But for us in middle schools, we sort of kind of end at resolution. But denouement happens after the resolution, which is like the ending of the story. Yeah. So, what is an exposition? An exposition is where the storyteller introduces the scene or setting and introduces the characters. Sometimes the author includes some background story, some background information about the story. So when you see this in your plot diagram, you are going to introduce just the beginning of your story. So remember, plot mountain, we are at the beginning of the story. So you introduce your setting in the exposition, the setting is introduced, and then in the exposition, the author introduces the characters. Like any trip, we don't know what's going to happen next. So when you write the characters in your exposition, you are writing the characters from the standpoint of the beginning of your story. So the characters that will be introduced later on, we don't know who they are because we are just beginning our story. So we write here in this part, we write the characters that are introduced to us in the beginning of the story. And here we write the situation or beginning. What are the events that are transpiring in the beginning of the story? And that is the exposition. So the exposition is important because it sets up the plot or the beginning of the story and it introduces us to our characters. So the second element of our plot diagram is the conflict. And obviously, here you have to indicate the conflict and then what type it is. When we say conflict, it is the struggle in the story or the problem. It could be both external or internal conflict. It's also called the inciting incident, which starts the chain reaction of events. When we say inciting incident, notice how in our plot diagram, everything is flat. And then when the conflict arises, right, in our plot diagram, this goes up. So when we say inciting incident, it starts the chain of events. And we know that the rising action starts after the conflict is introduced. So, a good example would be let's say you and your sibling, or you or your friend, or you or your sibling, fine. So, you and your sibling, you guys are talking to each other and you're just checking up on the day and you're like, how's your day? Blah, 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 blah. So, let's say, for example, your sibling or your friend says something that is disagreeable to you and you don't like it, or you contend it, or it upsets you, or it makes you sad, that conflict that was introduced in your conversation starts a chain of events, especially if your conversation with your sibling is about the chores and your sibling says, "Oh, you didn't do the chores yesterday and now I have to do them today." So that creates a chain of events because you will either just walk away or ignore, or you get into a heated conversation, or you tell your parents about it. So remember that the conflict is the inciting incident which starts a chain of events. So it starts a chain of events. And we know that the rising action does not start until the conflict. So we have the exposition right here. Once the conflict is introduced, it creates a chain of events, and then your rising action starts. Da da da. So once the conflict is introduced, the next element that we have is rising action. So it begins only after the conflict is introduced, and it presents one or several crisis moments, and it builds the suspense before the climax. So because it is a pyramid where we start here at the base exposition, we have the conflict that's introduced, and then the rising action begins. We start it from the bottom going up, because remember, you are climbing plot mountain. So we have some crisis moment, and then it slowly builds, and then it slowly builds, and then you get to your climax. So the rising action can present one crisis or several crises, but it builds the suspense before the climax. So it starts from the bottom, going up, up, and then we have our climax right there. So, when we get to the climax, we know that it is the turning point of the story where we have our greatest tension. Once again, our conflict could be internal or external. So, if it is an internal conflict where it's character versus self, this is the part where our character experiences the greatest tension within himself or herself. And here it will answer the question, will the main character be triumphant or defeated? So we know, going back, we know that conflict starts the chain of events. And we know that the climax is there when we answer the question, okay, is our main character going to be triumphant, or is our main character going to be defeated? So this is the part where we turn the story. It's the point of no return. It answers this question. So it's a turning point. This is the part where the story is going to turn. Will our character continue on as being a winner, or will our character be defeated, and would our character be lost or would have lost? So when we talk about climax, and I think also in the lower grades, it's easiest to remember as the most exciting part of the story. But climaxes can also be anticlimactic, because not like, let's look at this example. Okay, so let's look at Infinity War, um, with the Avengers. So we know that in the film, there are several exciting parts of the film, right? Is this the climax where we have all of the aliens' forces, and we have part of the Avengers in Wakanda and they started getting invaded? We know the battle scene. It's super exciting. Is this a climax? No, it's not. How about this part right here when we have Doctor Who, Mantis, Iron Man, we even have Spider Man here, like Guardians of the Galaxy, when they were fighting Thanos, and he was like seriously pulling the moon in. Is this the climax of the story? This is like super suspenseful. Is it? Well, No, it's not. So we know that the climax of the story is the part where Thanos snaps his finger. It's not suspenseful. It's not suspenseful. It's like, I'm sorry, it's not the most exciting part of the story because seriously, he just snaps his finger. But this is the climax of the story. We know that this is the climax of the story because this is the turning point. Will the Avengers win or not? We know that the conflict is Thanos is filling his gauntlet with the Infinity Stones. We know that the Avengers are stopping him, are trying to stop him, right? That's our conflict. And we have all of these exciting events that happened. We have a rising action. And then finally, we get to the climax of the story. Our question is, will the Avengers win or not? Will they be triumphant or will they be defeated? And in this movie, we know that they were defeated because our antagonist wins. And this is the turning point of the story. And notice how it is anticlimactic simply because our main character just snaps his finger and everybody just deatomizes or vaporizes and then they crumble to pieces. No, they evaporate, whatever you call it, but they're not there anymore. So this is an example of an anticlimax. All right. So once we get to the climax of our story, which is here, we now slide down or climb down um, our plot mountain, and we have the falling action. So falling action are the events that happen after the climax. The story shifts action, meaning it could be a little bit mellow or our characters do something else, but definitely the story can still have crisis moments, but our crisis moments are not as intense as our rising action, and our crisis moments are not going to be as intense as the climax. So it's very easy to identify what falling action is simply because obviously after the climax right here you know that it is the falling action of the story. And then finally we have our resolution, where the character finally resolves, whether it's positive or negative, the problem or the conflict. Once again, like in Infinity Wars, right? The resolution was null because our characters were not able to defeat the antagonist. So the conclusion of the story where we tie our loose ends. So if this were the Freytag pyramid, we'll have the resolution and then we'll have the denouement, which is seriously just the end of the story. So let us look at an example of a plot diagram. So here in our plot diagram or our Freytag experiment that was taken from clearvoice.com, which is their blog, we have the exposition where our setting was introduced an urban area. We have an inciting incident. Somebody calls, "Help me, I'm being abducted." And once we get this call or we have this conflict, look at how our story rises and builds in suspense. Our main character rushes to the rescue. He gets to the scene and he sees his sister being abducted by aliens. He climbs into the alien spaceship and he sees his sister, and then he saves his sister, and then they were trying to escape and he battles it out with this alien. He probably realizes how to use this blaster or light beam or something or some tool, and then denouement, it ends and he saves his sister, and the sister goes, "I love you, thank you so much for saving me, you are the best brother ever." And that ends our plot diagram. A little bit abrupt, but we're doing a different activity after this. All right, sweet. So don't forget, exposition, inciting incidents or conflict. We have our rising action. We have our climax. We have our falling action. And we have our resolution or denouement.